And today we're speaking again with Hannah Timson. Hannah, welcome back to the show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. We were just speaking a few weeks ago with Mike Lawrence on the subject of childhood indoctrination. That was a great time speaking to that. And I just wanted to go over your story today, but I'm going to give a brief bio for you and then start into your story. Hannah lives in Exeter in Devon, which I know nothing about. I'd love to hear more about that. You grew up Baptist, but eventually deconverted from Christianity, which will be a large part of our focus today. You were the former president at Humanist Students UK. You studied theater sound at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, studied theology and religion at the University of Exeter, and you're working on your master's in sociology at the same school. Is that all correct so far?
That's correct. Yeah.
And you took part in the Christian in an Amish documentary. You were the Christian character in an Amish documentary. And I heard a little bit about that, but I'd love to hear a brief summary of that when we get to that. You've been a guest several times on Justin Brierley's show, Unbelievable, which is really cool. I've seen some of those interviews. And you currently live in a made-over bus, which is really cool. Is that what you call it, a made-over bus?
Pardon me?
What would you call that, a made-over bus? Is that the way you describe it?
Renovated, it's changed use sort of thing, but it still drives. So we're halfway through building it, but we live in it now, and we're getting a new mattress tomorrow. So I'm very excited. We've been sleeping on the floor on a sort of a bit of a rubbish mattress. So it's all going. Yeah. Is it
like a made-over school bus or like a London kind of bus? What kind of bus is it?
So it's like a London bus, but it's from 1996, and I don't know how much they know about double-decker buses in the US, but they do change. Like basically, often they start off sort of in the big cities, and then they'll move to the smaller cities, and so once the bigger cities get like brand new eco buses or something. So this is not a particularly eco-friendly bus. It's from 1996 Volvo Olympian, if anybody out there is a bus fanatic. And yeah, it's a double decker, so it's kind of, we were quite inspired by the schooly renovations that you have in America. I do love schoolies. I think they're beautiful, but we don't really have anything like that here. We have single deckers, but we just figured that it would be a bit too small. And then this one kind of came up on Facebook Marketplace. So we were like, well, and it was really cheap. So we were like, we've got to do it now. And it seems to be working out all right. So yeah, we're very lucky.
Great way to express your creativity. I had a quick icebreaker. If you were independently wealthy, what would you be doing right now, most likely?
That's a question.
Or to ask another way, if you win the lottery tomorrow.
Wealthy. If I was to win the lottery tomorrow, I think probably I'd be looking at houses in Sweden. I'm quite tempted. Then I mean, they're not expensive. If you were to do a sort of a holiday home, we'd probably go move out that way, live off the land. I've got to a point in my life where I'm kind of done with busy city life. As you can tell, I live off grid on a bus. I do quite I love people, so that would be a bit of a strange change for me. But I think do that, buy property, and then go see the world, which probably is quite a boring.
That sounds great.
Boring answer. Yeah, that's what I do. Yeah, if I could, we go do a lot of traveling, basically. Yeah.
More stuff that feeds the soul. It sounds like.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Could you introduce us to who you are in terms of your background? What was your childhood like? Go as generic or deep as you feel like, but tell us enough to tell us where you were coming from before your deconversion happened.
So I grew up in a place called Hackney, which is in East London, which at the time, when I was a little girl, was quite a rough area, and sort of over 10 years or so, it was still quite poor and quite rough, but there was quite a strong sense of community. And then slowly Hackney's kind of become quite gentrified. So a lot of people, when they talk about Hackney now, they think, oh, well, it's quite posh and lots of millionaires live there, as has happened with a lot of London. So that's kind of where I'm from originally. But I kind of did grow up with this great sense of community. Everybody knew each other. And my church was very much integrated into the local community as well. And then I spent a lot of time. So I did a lot of church, but I also, and I think that's not something I brought up before, was did a lot of scouting, Girl Guides and brownies and that sort of thing. So that was kind of the other thing that I was doing during the week when I wasn't at church, and also obviously music and stuff like that. So Yes, from the age of 5, I was doing what we call rainbows here. So
You're an
that was,
accomplished musician as well, right? You do a lot of singing.
I'm a singer. I wouldn't say I was a musician.
Okay.
I'm not particularly what's the word? I sing opera, I sing classical music, but I'm not particularly technical, and I never really learned to be. I think that there wasn't a massive focus on that as a child. I went to comprehensive schools, so for the American audience, that's public school. Public school in England is private school, which is a bit confusing. But yeah, so that was a state funded school basically.
Your singing first started in a Christian environment.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I've always loved music and Julie Andrews and all that sort of stuff. I'm a bit of an oddball, I think, on that front for somebody of my generation. But yeah, I think that a lot of my musical stuff came out of church, and that is something that I really do miss. And actually, people that I talk to who, a lot of people who were worship leaders in the church, or they grew up particularly singing in the church, very like charismatic evangelical Christian type churches. When they left, I had one of my friends, she came around to my house and we had like a secret little like sing song. I don't repeat it, but we were like, I don't get to sing these songs anymore, and actually I really used to love singing these songs, and so we just got together and sang some secular songs, but actually some of the charismatic music together too. And so yeah, I think a lot of it did start at church, particularly when I was very little, and then as I grew up, I started going to sort of Saturday schools for theatre, and then sort of carried that on through school, doing a lot of because my school was a Church of England school, so a lot of the music was a bit less happy clappy and more choral, if that makes sense. So I did a bit of a mixture of all that bit, and then musical theatre and opera were the bits that I did. So yeah, I guess I've had a good few sort of strings going along in my life. And
your parents were Christians, is that right?
Yeah, my parents are both Christians. My grandfather was who used to live around the corner, was a missionary in places like Japan, and he sort of go backwards and forward. He wasn't sort of missionary who'd stay there for a very long time, but though it was obviously quite an important aspect of who he was, and he was sort of seen as a very godly, very nice man. And I love my granddad was a lovely man and had very good intentions. My mum is what I might call a more liberal Christian, in the sense of she believes in science and evolution and all those sorts of things, as well as having Christian faith. My father's beliefs have kind of shifted and changed a lot over the years, and he's definitely very fundamentalist, and as I sort of mentioned before to you, I don't think he would look out of place in American sort of Bible Belt country. And actually, in fact, a lot of the preachers that he listens to very loudly around the house on his earphones are American preachers. So I find that kind of theology really interesting. Yeah.
Is that a little bit less frequent to come across in England? It seems like, just from my limited exposure, that I come across a lot more liberal, either Church of England or just liberal Christians in general, and that the fundamentalist Christians just seems like they see it as like a very Americanized kind of version.
It really is. I mean, frankly, my dad's kind of beliefs get laughed at by a lot of English Christians, and even Europeans tend to be a lot more liberal and nuanced, and tend to believe in science, and not that Dad doesn't believe in science. He's a nurse, but he also we went at one point to after I stopped believing, we went to the British Museum, which has a lot of different artifacts from thousands of years ago, about humankind and our history, particularly British history, but also a lot of the history that we've stolen from other people. And he sort of did this whole thing where he had believed that the world was 6,000 years old, like a lot of young Earth creationists do. They're very literalist in the way that they read the Bible. And I sort of said to Dad, here, look at this skull. I think it was called the Jericho skull, and that's about 9,000 years old. And I said, well, Dad, how can this skull be here? And they've carbon dated that, so they're almost certain that this is 9,000 years old. And it just doesn't make sense that you think the world is 6,000 when there's evidence of life far beyond that. Was God just like having a joke? And he was just sort of like, oh, well, I didn't really say that it was definitely only 6,000 and whatever years old. So so there's definitely some sort of, and he probably, actually, if he watched this back, he would probably take he might have changed his mind by now, but there was definitely a kind of level of young earth creationism and stuff to do with the flood really happened, all that sort of stuff. Loves Ken Ham, who I find just hilarious. I like watching his stuff, actually, because for me it's just, I just don't understand how people can watch him. And even as a Christian, before, I would have found his stuff very far-fetched. And I believed things like the flood was real, that Jonah really lived in the belly of a whale, that Moses really existed, and the story of the Jews and all that sort of stuff. And I do believe that my dad, so there's a very American perspective, and I think that Donald Trump shares it, in the fact that, so if all the Jews go back to Israel, that Jesus will return. I don't really understand where that's come from. I think it's something from Revelation, but I found that very funny, because my heritage is Jewish, so technically I am genetically Jewish. I said to Dad, well, what are they going to do, pick me up in a helicopter and take me to Israel so that Jesus can come back? It doesn't make any sense to me. But yeah, he has this kind of, and again, he might have changed his mind, so sorry, Dad, if you're watching. But I do remember having these kinds of conversations with him. And even very recently, he protested a gay pride event in London, that for me, and for actually quite a lot of people at my church, they found very hurtful. I think a lot of the younger people in the church, who are a bit younger than my dad, were like, hold on, has he been radicalized? And I was like, no, Dad's always believed this stuff, very much so. He just has stopped, wasn't quite as vocal about it. And it does worry me, and I don't want to out members of my family, but there's certain members of my family that are gay, and queer, so for them that must have been extremely hurtful. I mean, for me, it was hurtful enough that he felt the need to go out and say something, but he thinks that he's being, this is the difficult thing, is that he thinks that he's being loving. He thinks that he's helping people, he's saving people. And he's not the only person in this country that does that sort of thing. I mean, he wasn't standing at the picket fence on his own holding a sign, but it's a very, like I say, a very Americanized form of belief, and actually a very young theology, in the way that it's developed. Most people aren't literalists in the same way as my father, but again, many people do believe that the stuff in the Old Testament really happened. And from my theological experiences and studies, a lot of that stuff archaeologically can't be proved, so it's more political and allegorical. So and I'm sure that Dad understands, he very well read in all the scholarship and the Bible stuff. It's just interesting what he chooses to believe. So but yeah, my mum is very much what I would call a typical English Christian.
Just a quick note, I was going to interact with your thought about evolution. You might find this funny, you may have even heard this before, but I was asking a young earth creationist a while ago what they do with the idea that the starlight that comes to us is millions and even billions of years old. How do you deal with the fact that they can tell using very, very advanced scientific methods that light, wherever it originated from, it didn't obviously just get here, it had to travel to us, and that travel time took millions and billions of years to get here. How do you deal with that? And their answer was, well, God created that star, and it literally is 13 billion light years away from us, but and that light literally is traveling to us, but God created all the light in the middle. Like, he literally created it deceptively to make it look like it was 13 billion years old, but he created all the light that would need to travel in the middle, so that when we see it, we're tricked. And it's almost like
it's
some
such
other
a
ways.
jump, isn't it? It's such a oh yeah, it's all fake, like the dinosaurs. I'm in a group which I still to this day can't work out whether it's a trolling Facebook group or a real Facebook group where it's called Christians Against Dinosaurs, and I can't work out, I don't know if you're in that group.
No.
I quite enjoy that, and I think that half of it's a load of non-religious people trolling Christians, and half of it might actually be Christians genuinely believing that dinosaurs weren't real, and I think a lot of it's just this anti-science perspective that we've got. And I think we do have to be critical of the scientific process. We do have to sit back and think, actually, does this work? Is this the right way to be doing things? Is what scientists are doing effective, and not just taking things at blind faith, because I think that there sometimes is a little bit of what's the word, like, oh, the scientists know best, or like the scientists are doing their thing, and not really I think that that kind of what's the word, that is a sort of mistaken way of looking at science, because science is ever evolving. It's not the same as religion, where it's kind of, well, that is ever evolving through culture, but it's different in the sense of, like, there are some set traditions and some set rules that you need to follow, whereas with science there is a scientific method, but the findings are ever evolving. And I think that people seem to sometimes be like, but that's true. It's fact. So I think that it does, and that's not for me. Some people go too far and reject science altogether, and that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. So I think there are some people who just go, science is king, and then you've got the other side of people going, oh, science is absolute baloney, they're just trying to trick us, conspiracy theorist type thing. Whereas I feel like perhaps there's, okay, not exactly middle ground. I think I'm probably closer to the science is king side, but there's kind of a balance where you can go, actually, there is a bit more philosophical thought that needs to be given to the process of science.
And the checks and balances to it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think what my dad and these young earth creationists and climate change deniers and all sorts, and actually it's interesting that quite a lot of those tend to be fundamentalist Christian. Why? I don't know what my dad thinks about climate change, but a lot of that is basically like, we know best and the scientists are wrong and they're just trying to trick us. It's kind of like, not, it's about rejecting authority, basically, and not trusting that sort of thing.
There's like an assumed bias because they don't subscribe to your God, and most of them probably to other gods too, but for sure they don't subscribe to the God of the Bible, or at least the conservative fundamentalist way. So therefore they're kind of in this godless category, and Christians kind of assume, well, if you're assuming it's not the God of the Bible, you're assuming godlessness, therefore your conclusions are fundamentally flawed because you're not bringing God into the equation.
Right. And ultimately as well, I mean, a lot of scientists are Christians. In fact, quite a lot of the first scientists, I will say first scientists, but the people who helped develop the scientific method were Christians in their own right as well. So it interests me that in England, that most religious I could say most religious believers do kind of bow a little bit to the science.
So we've talked a little bit about your parents and some of the fundamentalist beliefs, but at what point would you say that you yourself placed your faith in Christ as your savior? Were you just a little girl, or were you older?
I definitely was just a little girl. So within the Baptist tradition, I don't know what it's like. I know Baptist Christianity in the States is a little bit different. It seems a little bit more fundamentalist to me. But the main part is that you can't make a decision about your faith until you're at the age of reason. So, and I think that my church really didn't baptize people until they were in their teens. But there was definitely like an encouragement to give your life to Christ at a very young age. So obviously you give your life to Christ the first time, and then you make that kind of journey towards baptism. So
kind of rededicate your life to Christ.
Pardon me?
Kind of rededicate your life to Christ when you're a little bit older.
Yeah. So what happens? So at least in my church, so what begins is, so obviously, so I used to be really scathing about Catholics who baptized their children, like christened their babies, because I was like, well, they can't make a decision about whether they want to be be one of Christ's children or whatever at that age. So how can you bring them into the church without them having physically decided themselves. It's kind of in some way I saw it as a little bit like circumcision. It's a kind of welcome to the community kind of thing, without perhaps mutilating a baby's body, but in a similar
mutilating
kind
their
of
mind,
way.
perhaps.
Yeah, and also it's probably not a very comfortable process. But what happens is, so in some ways there was, and actually, I'm quite grateful to the Baptist Church that was instigated in my mind, that you had to choose Jesus and to choose to be a Christian. But obviously, it was kind of a false dichotomy. It wasn't really a choice, for the most part. Because you knew that you would go to hell if you didn't choose. It's not really a real choice, is it? Like, oh, Jesus or burn in the fiery pits of hell forever, or be cut off from the love of God, whichever you believe about the afterlife and hell and whatever. But so the process is that your parents dedicate you to the life of the church, to God. So it's kind of like a parental and a community decision to say, we will bring this child up to be a Christian, to walk in the ways of Jesus, etc., etc. And they hold the baby up in front of the church, maybe when the baby is 1 or 2. So it's it might be similar to like a naming ceremony. It is kind of like christening, but it has a different implication. It's not really about saving your immortal soul at that point. It's just like a community decision to actively try and bring you up in the Christian way, right? Which, and also I kind of like that, because it's not just on the parents to bring up the child, and it's also on the church or the community around them to look after the child as well, and to look out for their well-being. And if I didn't think that the Christian faith was so damaging, I'd quite like the idea that everybody's looking out for everybody, and everybody is like there for your child, but so that's how it begins. And then you obviously go to Sunday school, and from a very little age, you're in the creche, and which is like a nursery or kindergarten. Might be younger than kindergarten. It's like from a tiny little baby until you're about 3 or 4, and then you would start on, I can't remember the name of the Christian, basically there are a whole load of like magazines. It's very old-fashioned, that and I don't know whether they still do it now, but where the Sunday school lead teacher would read from that particular thing every Sunday in your Sunday school. So, and then once a month we would have what we would call like an all-age service. And it got to the point when we were older that the children were leading that, like the young people would lead the church. So obviously it would have a lot of input from adults, but it would be directly focused on everybody coming together, children and adults. And at one point the youth started leading, and then even the children's group were reenacting different scenes from the Bible and all sorts of stuff like that, and even give praying, and even giving kind of sermons, which to me is just, now, even at the time it was a bit like, well, what do they know, kind of thing. But it's like, and I obviously was leading the music and doing bits like that. So we used to have youth services specifically designed and led by the youth and the youth pastor, things like that. So as I got older, that was also still a thing. So actually it was a very young person led or focused church. So you'd have the dedication, then you go to sort of Sunday school, all the way up till sort of, I think it's like 12, 13, it gets to a point, and then you start sort of gradually integrating into the youth group, and then the youth kind of goes on until you're about 18, 19. I think there were a lot of people there who even sort of into their 20s, who would come out and maybe even help as they got older. So that was a big aspect of my life, because it was, obviously that was what you would do on a Sunday, but then there were also like clubs and stuff that you could go along to, and Bible studies. And then I started getting involved in the music as well. So not just, singing on the Sunday or whatever, but it would be like playing in the band on stage and that sort of stuff. And it was, it wasn't like it's not like a Hillsong kind of church. It's not at all like that. But it's definitely happy clappy, Tim Hughes, Matt Redman kind of music. I don't know if you guys sing that sort of stuff out there as well. Fun stuff, basically.
Did you feel like through all those stories, did you feel pretty happy with that? I mean, obviously you didn't know everything you eventually learned, but
well, I'm in the sense of like I believed it was true. So I believed that everything that my mum told me pretty much was true. My parents told me, my dad as well. In some ways, actually, and I think that that's true of a lot of families, that the mother is often the person who passes on their beliefs. So, if my dad had been the person to sort of tell me nighttime stories, and I'm hoping that that's kind of culture is changing, but obviously it was my mum who would often put me to bed and she would read me stories, and we had like the kids' Bible, that sort of stuff, so we'd read from that. And then, we'd say our prayers, and then mum would say, things like, angels watch over you and stuff like that. So we definitely believed in like angels and demons and stuff. And do
you remember that being scary at all, ever?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, there are other reasons for why, I don't really feel like it. And maybe at some point I'll feel confident enough to share them on the internet. But, for my family's sake, I think it's probably not the best thing to share. There are other reasons why I suffer from extreme anxiety. And obviously I've worked through that as I've got older. But one of the main sources, I've always been frightened of the dark. And actually the thing, I mean, and children are, right? Children as a kind of rule. I mean, the dark is scary if you don't know what's lurking in it. But I was obviously told stories about... so there was one particular story I remember when I was 14 that I think I might have even been told at Soul Survivor, which is kind of like New Wine, which is like a family focused event that happens. It's like it happens in a big tent, or there's a number of big tents at New Wine, and then they split off into younger different groups for different ages, and it's basically like a big celebration of Christianity or whatever. But it was my youth pastor who told the story, and the story he told was about parents who were reading Harry Potter at night. And this isn't actually a common belief in Britain, that Harry Potter is a bad thing. Like, right. most Christians are like, yeah, whatever, like it's just a story. It's definitely a lot more permanent, permeable across the pond. But basically they were reading Harry Potter, and they started to see their son kept coming into their bedroom at night time and being like, oh, there's a man at the end of my bed or whatever. And he was like obviously terrified, and they were like, oh, I don't really know why he's experiencing this. They believed that whatever it was at the end of his bed was real, or at least a threat to their son. And so they were praying to God, oh, please, let us know why he's experiencing this. Why is he so frightened? Well, kids see things. Kids have wild imaginations, but they then came to the conclusion that God had told them that it was because they were reading Harry Potter, which is just mental. But I know I'd read Harry Potter by that point. I started reading Harry Potter, and my mum actually, kudos to her, introduced me to Harry Potter when I was 6 or 7, which is when it started to become quite popular. So it's not that mum was ever like that necessarily, but it's the culture, right, that you grew up in. So he's sort of being like, they threw all the books away, or they burned them or something, I don't know. And from that point on, he stopped seeing the figure at the end of his bed. And I remember, maybe I was a bit younger, I don't even know, to be honest, but it was definitely 14 or under, between the age of 10 and 14 that I heard that story. And every night I would go to sleep and I just couldn't turn the light off, because I was really frightened that there would be something there. And it sounds really stupid because I don't believe any of it now. There's still a bit in my head going, oh, but there might be something there.
Yeah. So it reminds me of the stories you hear about the boogeyman, or
right, yeah, exactly. Or I can't remember. It's the boogeyman basically, but things like that. So that was a story, and obviously I'd read Harry Potter, so I was a sinner, and I was obviously inviting dark spirits into my life and things like that by doing those sorts of things. And
have you ever?
He had some very odd beliefs, actually. Yeah.
Have you ever heard of an author named Frank Peretti?
No, I don't. No, I haven't.
Back when I was in the age of being in the youth group and so forth, he was pretty popular. He wrote these books. I know one of them was called This Present Darkness, and there were some others that were, around that idea of, piercing the darkness or something like that. but it was the idea that there are demons like all over the place,
Oh
and that
yeah.
like if you could put on special glasses to see them, and look up even in church, you'd look up and see them flying all around you, and it's
Yeah, so that's what I believed. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. The spiritual battle that goes on above your head, sort of thing. Yeah, I definitely believe that that was real.
yeah, and that they could
I
even
didn't read that
potentially
book.
get in your mind a little bit and try to trick
Oh
you.
yeah. Well, because the fact that the reason that I had to have angels watching over me was just because maybe, if there weren't angels there, that Satan would kind of get into my brain, or maybe I'd die in my sleep, or maybe I'd get sick, or something. So, despite actually I quite enjoyed being a Christian, I enjoyed the music, I enjoyed the community, and I, enjoyed the fact that perhaps there was a God who loved me, and that there was like kind of in some ways a magic man in the sky who would listen to my prayers. In some way that was kind of comforting, but now when I think back on it, there was also this kind of anxiety that came with it. Like I was always on edge, and I suffer now from chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, and I have autoimmune hypothyroidism, which is something that people in their middle age get, rather than I actually developed it at 17, which is sort of the age that when I went to live with the Amish, and then I started considering leaving Christianity. And all of those kind of diseases, inflammatory diseases, which are on the rise in across sort of the Western world anyway, but they say that those come from extreme stress. And I mean, I was always an anxious child, and I as I say, I don't think it was just down to Christianity, but I think that things that happened to me as a child and the beliefs that my parents have and had definitely allowed those things to happen. The idea of like your father being the head of the family, and having this level of authority, that perhaps when I say ordinary family, a family that didn't have those kinds of paternalistic beliefs about God, man, woman, children, and us being the naughty and what's the word? I don't even know. Not good enough. We had to learn to behave, spare the rod, spoil the child kind of belief.
Depraved,
depraved. Yeah. We needed to be saved from ourselves, that sort of stuff. Which all sounds, it sounds so hyperbolic, and it annoys me because a lot of Christians go, well, we don't teach our children that. You know what I mean? Like they don't. We're not. That's not how I think. And I know that there are a lot of Christians who don't think like that. But for every one Christian who doesn't think like that, there's another one who does, and there is another child who is going through what I went through as a child. I remember when I used to fight with my little brother, because Josh is like, my brother is like 2 years younger than me. There was one point we used to fight really, a lot, like sort of fisticuffs, rough house kind of thing. And it was kind of playing, play fighting like kids do. But then at the same time, there was also this kind of level of anger that came with it. And I just remember at one point, because my brother was really quite a naughty kid. Sorry, Josh, if you end up watching this, but he was, and people found him quite difficult to deal with a little bit. It was just adventurous and didn't think inside the lines like everybody else. And he could be naughty, I think. I just remember sort of looking at him and going, I see the devil in your eyes, which is such a weird thing for an 8-year-old child to say to her brother.
Yeah.
But I just remember, and I remember thinking, well, that was a horrible thing to say. What a horrible thing to say. But then at the same time, I was convinced that I'd seen the devil in his eyes. He was probably being very nasty to me, but at the same time, he was, a child. But where did that come from? Where did that idea of the devil being inside my brother come from?
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of things about. I don't know if we believed in exorcism. But definitely, I mean, well, yes, we did, because I do remember the story of Jesus casting the spirits out of the pigs, being taught quite a lot actually at church, and talked about quite a lot. And so, I think demons definitely came into it. But then if you were to talk to people about what they believed about Christianity, and the people in my church, I mean, it might change a bit now, but mainly it would be, they would say the kind of basic things that everybody believes, Jesus died and rose again, I'm saved, hallelujah. But then if you dive deeper, or if you were to actually watch the church services, the amount of conversation about demons and spirits, which to me seems, it's not even really a massive, well, maybe it is a big part of the Bible, but it's not a part that a lot of like liberal Anglican Christians even focus on. You know, they
Yeah.
don't focus on demons and spirits.
More just about the
And
gospel.
actually, we would have laughed at Catholics who, you know, we see them, you know, with all their paintings of their saints and their demons and whatever in their, you know, massive cathedrals and what have you. Because I was a, you know, Protestant Christian, you know, and even the Anglicans were, you know, they're a little bit too Catholic for us, you know, high church or whatever.
Did you have any Catholic friends growing up?
Not that I was aware of. No, not that I was aware of. Anglican, yeah, because that's just everybody's a church. You know, if you're not another denomination of Christian, you're an Anglican. So my school was Anglican, so Church of England, as a little girl. So I definitely had a lot of that theology, which was slightly different and a little bit more relaxed than the kind of Pentecostalist kind of beliefs that I had.
So can you walk us into where any doubts, like what was the very first doubt you can remember that came on the radar?
The first
issue. Like
the first issue that raised, I'm sure there were a few things where I was like, that just doesn't make sense. Like, you know, how did Jonah survive in the belly of a whale for however many nights, you know, or how did the flood happen, you know, because those are kind of two impossible stories really. And obviously I think that those were kind of explained by, well, God could do anything, sort of thing. So I was like, oh yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I suppose he could. And then, you know, as a little girl, and then I remember having conversations about, well, why about the Jews? Because so as I said, like we have Jewish heritage, and I think that because my mother and then my mother's mother and mother, so that makes me Jewish. You know, so we have that kind of heritage on one side, and I do remember being like, but why were the Jews the chosen ones then, but not when why did Jesus not come for the Jews? And I remember asking questions to my mom about, okay, but before Jesus came, what happened to all those people? Were they saved? And I think mum didn't really know, so she sort of said, oh, they're just saved by proxy or whatever. You know, God wouldn't let them go to hell. They didn't have the chance to choose Jesus, sort of thing. But I mean, those are genuine questions, and actually probably quite well thought out questions for a girl of however old I was. You know, definitely was never the sort, and so that's why I always thought, you know, I do question. I have got questions, but they're always kind of explained by really at the time I should have seen as not particularly good answers. It was just sort of like, well, God works in mysterious ways. Maybe this isn't the right time for you. So, you know, like the prayer thing always got, well, the prayer thing is weird because it got me, then it didn't get me, in the sense of I didn't really realize how silly prayer is in the sense of, well, okay, so God has a path for me, but also then I can also choose to go my way or God's way, but God is all knowing and always will know what I'm going to ask for before I ask for it, and God is also going to know, what's the word, like God has also, you know, dictated the future. So really there isn't such a thing as choice. Like Christians really believe what I believe, which is determinism. It is determined by God. So but then they don't believe, they would never say that they believe that. They believe in liberal free will, which is just not a thing. But the prayer thing was strange because it was like, so we used to sing a song as a kid, which is prayer is like a telephone for us to talk to Jesus. Prayer is like a telephone for us to talk to God. And then it would be like, pick it up and use it every day. So like the first thing that you're encouraged to do as a little girl is talk to Jesus, you know, like he's your best friend. Like I didn't know Jesus, but he, like, apparently he was there, so I have to talk to him, but really what I'm doing is talking to an imaginary friend. But then also, you know, asking for things, and then when things didn't happen, it was, you know, because it wasn't the right time. I said, what's the point in asking for these things if God is already knows that he's going to say no to what I was going to ask him for anyway? So that was a kind of conundrum, and I didn't really come to that conclusion until maybe the second year of my theology degree at 22. And I went, what? Why are we doing this? Why are you doing this? To my Christian friend, I said, that doesn't make any sense. Hold on.
Did they ever throw at you the idea that prayer isn't meant to change God, it's meant to change you? I got that one thrown at me a little bit too.
Well, like I don't have a problem with that, right? It's a form of meditation. And actually there's a certain aspect of the prayer thing which I think actually is quite good. You know, it lets you reflect on the things that you're grateful for, the things that you want in life. It's a kind of self-evaluation but then why do it like that? Why not just talk to yourself or write it down in a book? Or, you know, it clearly is meant to try and change God's mind. Unless you're just trying to moan at God about something, you know, which apparently you're not allowed to do according to the story of Job. You know, it's, you know, stop whining at God kind of thing.
Yeah, prayer is really a big deal. That was part of my last big hurrah in my pre-deconversion time. I was working on a prayer book. It was like 1,000 pages. I still have it, and it was basically the idea of that prayer is meant to change you, but taking that and putting it kind of on steroids. And saying, like, you know, if you were to go to church or read a book, say you read C.S. Lewis, or you're reading a devotional, and somebody says something that's really profound, like, whoa, that's like something I feel like I should go back to every week or month, for sure every year, and just kind of think about, let it kind of hit me over and over. And I was like, well, I've done that over and over, but I forget all that stuff that, you know, I read and, you know, learned in C.S. Lewis or whoever. So why not take like the high points of something that I would highlight in the book, write it down, flip it into a prayer, you know, like C.S. Lewis might say something. I'd say, well, I can say, God, you are like this, you're like that, or you're doing this, you're doing that. And just actually pray it to God. And that was like my biggest, right before I deconverted, that was my biggest push, was how do we take our thought life and turn it into like a constant prayer to God, where we're just like, the focus is just changing our worldview at the deepest levels. And it's if you're into it, it really does seem like that's where it's at the end of the day. This is about transforming our minds to really praise God as much as we can. And
but surely what it's doing is kind of just conditioning you.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is what I think it is. It's a form of self-conditioning that you're taught and it's handed down, where, you know, what you're saying is it changes you. Well, yes, it does change you, because you continue to, you know, you're like, oh, I strayed from the path today. You know, I thought, you know, that man was sexy or something. Oh no, let me go and pray about my terrible, sinful, very human thought, you know, and kind of push down, repress those kind of feelings. So yeah, what it is doing is it is changing you, but it's not changing you, you know, it's not allowing you to go, well, actually, was that okay? Well, no, you're repeating to yourself all the things that you've been taught as you've grown up, that was a horrible thing to think, and that you are disgusting. And
it's taking the indoctrination that you've been given and doing it to yourself, basically, to dig your own heels in and make your stance even firmer, not realizing that you're taking the party line that you've already been, you know, kind of mesmerized by, and just doing it now to yourself instead of something else doing it. You're turning the power of this cult towards yourself. And it's so when you're,
and I think that is the most, for me, the one incredible thing about some of these beliefs is that it takes it from being a community focused thing, where you turn up, you have fun, you enjoy everybody's, you know, company, and you're taught a few things, to, even though you might leave the church, and I you know, I've said this, you know, like the dark figure at the end of the room, I still see that now. And I still sometimes think, oh, you know, I question myself and I self-police myself, right? What it's done is it plants this seed in young minds, and it is, you know, I mean, adults also come into it, and adults do come into certain, you know, cults and stuff like that, and are successfully indoctrinated into those, and Christianity as well, I think. But it is so much more successful in doing it to children, because you know, you don't know any better, and you trust authority, and you have no other choice, really. So it's just like consistently conditioning you to know that you're never alone, which is awful, ever. And I actually was like, oh, isn't it lovely that you're never alone? And I kind of think now, like, and particularly I think as teenagers grow up, they kind of go, I wish I was kind of alone. Like, isn't it weird that God watches me do this? Like, or whatever, you know. So
do you ever think, though, on that note, that's like, that particular point you just made, it was almost an indication that we didn't really believe? Like, what I mean is this: if you were to say, if you really believe, for example, that when someone dies in Christ, that they're a Christian, they go to heaven. So if you see a teenager, 17, gets cancer, it's horrible, 6 months later they're dead. What a horrible situation. I'm sure it happens all the time. But if that person had placed their faith in Christ, then there's ultimately not really a sadness to it, because they're now free, they're in glory. But you often will see people who face these horrible situations just endlessly grieving. And I'm not saying everyone does, I'm sure there's some exceptions, but a lot of people, it's like, oh, this was just like the worst tragedy of our family. It's like, how can it really be a tragedy if you're in heaven? And it's kind of similar to that with like this whole I'm alone thing. Like if you were, for example, say you're a guy, you're looking at, dirty pictures. Well, if you really believe that God is right there in the room looking at you, and you're looking at, something you shouldn't in a catalog, and it's like you wouldn't actually be doing what you're doing if you really believe that God is right there kind of talking to you saying, hey, I'm watching. Just like, if a parent walked in on you, you'd quickly stop or something, you put it away. Well, if God's the ultimate parent and he's really right there, you'd put it away. The fact that you don't put it away is like evidence you don't actually believe this. It's like a make-believe that you are so conditioned to that you keep the make-believe going, even though you don't actually act like it's real.
It's interesting. I mean, because like there are a lot of people who talk about that kind of experience of, masturbation or whatever, and they still believe that God, there was like a shame, right? So God was watching. I don't know. Is that an indication that they don't really believe? I think a lot of people live their whole lives like that, in sort of shame that they're sinning and they're not doing the right thing, regardless of whether it's done in secret or in public. That whole and I'm sure there is such a thing as pornography addiction. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure that there are people who are addicted to pornography, just like you can be addicted to anything. But there's this, and they talk a lot about it in the church, which is really bizarre to me. It's kind of like in the secular world, that's not really a thing. Like you can't really, I say you can't really have a pornography addiction, but it's not like they would sort of talk about it like, oh, he was watching porn a couple of times a week and he was, he was addicted to it, and it was destroying his relationship between God and himself or something like that. It was like the thing that got in the way. So and there's this sort of thing, like it's like a block between you and God that you have to overcome in order to become closer to God. So it's your fault, not God's fault, that he allowed you to look at pornography. You made that choice or whatever. So I don't know, like, does it mean that they don't really believe? I don't know. I think it's kind of like maybe they just hope that they'll get away with it rather than and then live with the shame afterwards. It's like, for example, so and I've told this story, so it's not in it for me a big deal, but and in fact my grandparents disowned me after they heard me tell the story. But so when I was 17, I told this story about my ex-boyfriend, and actually just before I went to live with the Amish, we ended up sleeping together, and I kind of said to him, no, I can't, have sex with you because, that's against God, and, it made me dirty and whatever. And we talk about, and actually a lot of my youth pastor at church had a lot of input into this, and a lot of, one of my sort of female youth pastor also had a lot of input into this kind of, and we were talking about before, like purity culture, and the idea that perhaps your body is kind of like a horcrux. So like every man you ever have sex with, a part of yourself breaks off with him. You're giving yourself away to these people, to these men, which doesn't make any bloody sense. But I was told that by my mum. When you have sex with a man, you become one with him, and then you're breaking that bond, and between man and God. Like it's kind of like there's three people in this relationship: you, God, and the man, or the woman, or whoever you're sleeping with. I mean, obviously they think that it's men and women, so so that's that kind of idea. That, and I mean, in some way I suppose there is a physical, like, you do become one, right? But like that's the kind of, I think that's where that stems from. And then it's the idea that your spirit becomes one with this person. And obviously, so my partner had gone to me, but if God loves you, and he didn't, I don't think he pressured me in any way, actually. I think he was very nice about it, and actually if I'd asked him to hold off, he would have held off. But I wanted to sleep with him. Like, let's not bat around the bush. Like, women get horny too. And I was like, well, I sort of had to go away and think about it. He said, well, if God, has a problem with two people who love each other, sharing a bond with each other in this way, then, it doesn't seem like a very nice God. Like, why is it saved for marriage, And I don't know, I just remember thinking about that, and I thought, yeah, I do love this guy very much. And when we slept together, and then I cried like straight after having sex with him. And my sister actually told me she had exactly the same experience. That she said, I didn't realize that happened to you. Yeah, I cried too, because I thought I was dirty and broken and that God couldn't love me. But I knew that God was there. Like, do you know what I mean? I was aware that God had seen what had gone on, but it was that kind of experience of oh, now maybe I've gone too far.
Yeah.
But then also I'd already done it now, so so there's this kind of thing. And then I went to live with the Amish, and we can come back to the actual experience of that. But the big thing was, and I for a long time, my friends at university, because I sort of went back and talked about the experience and showed a few clips while I was at uni. And there's one scene where me and this other girl say, okay, well, yeah, there are some nasty men out there who all they want to have from you is sex. They don't just want, if you're after a relationship, they don't want to give you that relationship. And at that time, for me, that was what like, at least, if I wasn't going to be married and have sex, I was going to have sex within a loving relationship. It wasn't just when I was at university and started, having some fun, one of my friends, who actually is no longer, I don't think, a Christian, but she sort of fell off her chair when she told me, when I told her about all of the things that I'd done, because I was kind of like, oh wow, it sort of liberated me that perhaps sex didn't have to happen just because I was in a committed relationship. So I know everybody has different views on that, but that was kind of like, I took one step from the marriage thing, and then it was like a loving relationship, and then I took another step and I thought, oh well, maybe it can just be for fun and all that sort of stuff. But those kinds of things were never even on my radar as a Christian growing up. And I stopped believing in God by the time I started sort of playing the field, so to speak. But it's still there in the back of my mind now, like, or am I dirty? Am I a sinner? Not even a sinner, but am I a whore? Like, things like that. Like, and it's that kind of shame that Christianity puts on you. And I know that a lot of women have also had similar experiences. And what interests me is I've seen a lot of women talk about, Christian women who slept with their partner, and then they were, or their husband or whatever, and then they said, oh, well, was that it? Or they weren't sexually compatible and all this sort of stuff. And but yeah, well, does it mean that they don't really believe in God? I think that's kind of part of it. Is the shame is part of the conditioning. We all do things that, if I was to believe in God, that God wouldn't like. So it's that constant shame of being like, yes, so actually I am, no better than dirty rags to his, before God. Look at me, I'm doing all these terrible things that everybody does.
with that shame, both of in a sense of sexual desires, whatever, in the sense of just generally you're a sinner, you're a lawbreaker before God. Even theologically, you are in Adam, so to speak. Theologically, Adam sinned, therefore we're all condemned.
Right.
There is that sense of, like, even if it's not something as profound as a sexual thought or a sexual act that would bring shame, there's just this sense we all have of, like, we know our thoughts. Like, we're not always nice and kind. We're not always thinking for the best for the people.
Right.
And so there's always a reason, whether it's a minor reason or a more major reason, there's always a reason to think, I'm just not measuring up. And do you ever step back and just wonder, like, what your psychological makeup would be if you had been able to have a life from the youngest age where that just wasn't even part of the equation, where someone might say, hey, Hannah, you need to make wise decisions, or you need to be mature, you need to be thoughtful, you need to be you need to be thinking about other humans in a humanist way, would do the best for people. But taking all the shame and just not even making it part of the equation, it's just not even.
Yeah, for sure.
And how different would life be for people?
Well, for me, because I can only speak for myself, and I actually have thought about this and kind of grieved it a little bit, because I really didn't start experiencing life as myself as an individual, as an independent person, until I got to university, and I was 21 by that point. And even then, I was very tentative. I didn't really drink. I didn't really do, and I'm not saying that you have to do all of those things in order to experience life, but I didn't really know what it was that was important to me and what actually was good for me and wasn't good for me. And so, so some kids kind of go through that kind of stage where, they sleep around, they drink a lot of alcohol or whatever. I mean, maybe it's different in America because you have different rules, but in England, there's definitely a poor culture of a drinking culture here, for sure. People go out and binge drink and they don't look after themselves very much, but that's sort of, and people do that up into their late 30s or whatever, but or even later, but really it's a young person thing. And I think probably I would have ended up at university earlier. I wouldn't have had I mean, these are all speculation, but like, probably wouldn't have had as much anxiety as I had when I was a little girl. I don't really know who I would be, because to be honest with you, that anxiety has lived with me my entire life.
Wrapped up in your being wrapped up in like the shame sense.
The shame, yeah, and this kind of fight or flight mode, and there's always this sense of always. So the thing that I grieved the most was the idea that my life wasn't my own, and that I had to constantly be forgiving people that didn't deserve my forgiveness. Rather than so this idea of forgiveness really isn't about what's the word, like letting people off the hook, right? It's not about that. There is a way of coming to terms with things that have happened to you, in your life, without saying I forgive you, that was okay, right? But as a kid, and as a teen, and also really as I grew up into my adulthood, particularly with men, I would just let myself be walked over, because I believed that I can help them get better. I very much have and even now I'm a bit of an enabler, so I have very much this kind of sense of I can fix you, I can help you, I forgive you, I love you, and I said to my friend the other day, we have a group chat where we talk about political things, and we're talking about the Donald Trump, and I know that it's wrong, but I feel a sense of real deep empathy for Donald Trump. And he's an absolute arsehole. Sorry to the people, if anybody is watching this, who likes Donald Trump, but he's an arsehole and he's a narcissist. And there was one particular guy who came into my life a few years ago who he's not as stupid as Donald Trump. In fact, he's very intelligent, which is a problem. Who basically, he was very charming and very nice, but he made me feel little, and he made me feel like I was stupid. And I just I didn't even question it. It seems strange, but I was, oh yeah, of course you don't know that, of course you wouldn't. And it, kind of like a weird form of emotional manipulation, like narcissists love me. And it's because I'm a very empathetic person. And I do think that if I had grown up learning to put up more boundaries around my life and around who I am, and my mum would talk about things like protecting your heart, right, from bad things, but what she meant was protecting your heart from having sex with boys, right? Rather than protecting my heart from people who are emotionally manipulative or bad for you, because all I'd learned all of my life was to allow emotional manipulation to take place and just to kind of let it happen. And a lot of my life I kind of wanted to I was always, and there's nothing that really, both of my parents are nurses, for example, and it's a very laudable career, and I absolutely think that it's brilliant that people can dedicate their lives in that way. Definitely not for me. I don't do vomit, and I'm probably more of a caring person. I'm much more of a mental kind of person, so doing perhaps pastoral care or that sort of thing would probably suit me a little bit better. I think I will always be a kind and empathetic person, but there's kind of a line, does that make sense? Where it goes beyond the kind and the empathetic to feeling sorry for somebody like Donald Trump who has hurt a whole load of people. And yes, he might be hurting inside, which is why he is the way that he is, and but then to be a person who's hurting and then see it as kind of an excuse to then take down a whole country with him, or on a smaller scale, this guy that I had sort of relationship with, to take me down, and to take, basically he was one of those sorts of people who was very, very drawn to very sparkly people, right? People who had a lot to give him, and definite narcissist, sort of person who would use people until they weren't worth being used anymore, take everything from them, and then kind of walk away, and make them feel little and small. And it wasn't until I sort of met a few people who said, that's not right, why is he talking to you like that? And it was a repeated pattern, right? And there's probably something also to do with my childhood that wasn't just about religion, but there's definitely this kind of aspect where I've speaking to my sister as well, where she has said I've had to learn what boundaries are, because the church didn't teach me that. It taught me It taught me not to be sexual with a man too early on. It taught me that my desires were bad and dirty and depraved, but then everybody was a sinner, and that everybody was worth saving as well. That was the other thing. It was sort of like, well, you know, don't give up on somebody, because even if they're harmful and dangerous to you, don't give up on them. And I think that and then, you know, this is definitely a very like personal experience. I'm sure not every Christian that and
well, I think you're
you know,
bringing stuff up though that a lot of people can relate to in different ways. Like one thing I'll just mention that I've thought a lot about with what you just said, the boundaries issue. A lot of Christians really don't have the ability to distinguish between an actual professional, healthy, holistic counselor and a Christian. Like they're like, if you're struggling with, you know, just any issue that's like psychological, you need a counselor. But as a Christian, that counselor basically needs to be God in the Bible, meaning your pastor, your pastor's wife. They may have no professional ability to analyze you, and certainly not to prescribe medicine if that's what needs to happen. But it's like,
well,
I remember.
I laugh because so my parents, I don't think it's much of a secret that they have marital difficulties, but you know, and actually it really is, and what's kind of drawn me even further away, I think, from Christianity is that, you know, is the idea of that you make this promise to your spouse, till death do us part, you know, not until, you know, I you know, there's something to be said for trying to fix things, right? There's, you know, don't give up, particularly if you have history with somebody and actually this is probably just a blip, you know what I mean? Like, I think my dad has this kind of idea that I think that if you're not happy at one moment in your life, that, you know, it's over and you walk away. And thankfully I've never been in, you know, relationships long enough that, you know, it's become a drag or something like that. You just sort of realize that that person isn't the person for you or whatever. But for me, I would much rather spend my life, because I know that this is the one life that I have and that I'm not going to carry that person into the afterlife or whatever. It's only me who has to live my life, and I get to choose who is allowed into my life and who, you know, do they bring me value and can I bring value to their life, right? But so for my parents, that definitely, it's kind of like, well, I made this vow, and although we've been unhappy for 20 years, I'm gonna stay married to you because I made this vow, and I, you know, it would be shameful for me to walk away from my marriage, sort of thing. And that kind of, but the reason I laugh at the Christian counselor thing was because, so my mum had said, you know, we need to go and see a counselor, or you, to my dad, you need to go and see a counselor, which actually I think probably they both needed to do it, but there was definitely this kind of thing that my dad was the big bad wolf, and he said, well, no, I'm not doing it, you know, I need to see a Christian counselor. And so I don't know what their qualifications are, but I do remember being like, but why does it have to be Christian though? And you're right, yeah, it's definitely this kind of thing. Well, he needed to go back to the Bible, and obviously what a lot of the Bible teaches, and the, you know, whatever the counselor was telling my dad, kind of just reinforced the negative beliefs that he had about his relationship to his family and the home and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that is really interesting. Like, so he definitely has that kind of thing as well. I mean, I don't know how common it is in Britain, but I've seen a lot of Americans talking about Christian counselling as well. But he point blank refused to see a counsellor who wasn't a Christian, which just is so strange to me.
It is. We're definitely talking about a lot of the negative aspects that, you know, that either we've experienced or people do experience in Christianity. What were the final straws? Obviously, it sounds like, you know, I would assume that a lot of these issues that we're talking about, they kind of created a backdrop for you to eventually critique your faith very specifically. But what took you toward that final step of saying, all right, I need to figure this out? Like, what was that experience like, and what took you out of Christianity?
Oh gosh, I think that's the thing, is it wasn't like a final, like there was never a point where it was like, this is it. I don't believe anymore. It was definitely like an extremely slow process, because once you've been indoctrinated in that way, you know, where everything, you're second guessing yourself all the time, it's going to take a long time. And even now, I can't say that I've been completely deprogrammed, I guess. If we're talking about it in that kind of Matrix-esque way, I don't know, but like in the sense of I've not kind of I'm not kind of completely been deprogrammed, but I do know that I've definitely started thinking a lot more for myself now. But I think the final straw, when I realized that I was an atheist and not just an agnostic. I mean, I'm an agnostic atheist, but there's no such thing, in my opinion, as an actual agnostic. You know, you're either an atheist or you're not. So you know, that kind of word was quite helpful to me for a long time. But I think it was a process of, I stopped going to church as much as I did. I started going seeing my boyfriend at the time, who lived about an hour away from my house, and I was often there. So people will probably say, you know, he was, and actually people did on the Unbelievable show that I did recently, people say, oh, he was the devil, basically. And I was like, well, maybe he was, but, you know, he was a very, very charming devil, you know, and, you know, that was the devil tempting her away and blah, blah, blah. And obviously there was a whole load of, to be honest with you, it was all the rules that my parents had in my house, you know, that my partner couldn't do X, Y, and Z. He couldn't be there, he couldn't stay, well, he could stay overnight, but he had to sleep in another room. And you know, I wasn't allowed to be open with my relationship. My parents, my mom at least, definitely didn't approve of him. There was a whole lot of like secrecy around what was going on, so that definitely pushed me out of the house. So in some ways it was their Christianity that did that to me, not, you know, if they'd sort of said to me, okay, well, you make your own decisions. By the time I was about 18 by that point, so if they'd said to me, oh, well, 17, 18, you know, you make your own decisions, we're not particularly keen on this guy, but, you know, if you're happy, we're happy, because that for me is the most important thing for my children. I don't care if they're sinning or I don't agree with their actions, like, I don't know, as long as they're happy and healthy, then that's fine. But obviously for my parents, they thought that I was going to be unhappy by doing the things that I was doing. So it's not that they were trying to be cruel, but even now I'm not allowed. My partner and I have been together for a long time, and we live together, and if we were to go and visit my parents, we still wouldn't be allowed to sleep in the same bed, you know, because we're not married. And there's a whole load of that. My dad told his sort of like 50-year-old friend that she wasn't allowed to have her partner sleep in the bed with her as well if she came to stay, and all sorts of weird stuff. So, and for me, that's really bizarre. But it's that kind of my rules, my house, my rules. So that kind of began. I think a lot of kids get that from their parents. It's not just a religious thing. They kind of rebel against their parents' rules and stuff. But that really did push me away. And that then meant that I was staying at my partner's house every weekend, you know, because I wanted to be with him. I wanted to spend that time with him. And, you know, I never had a relationship like that before. And I think I'm the sort of person who's very intense when I, you know, first start seeing somebody. So, and then obviously our relationship blossomed and we were together for 2 years. And, you know, by the end of it, I didn't really like his attitude about religious people. I was still a Christian during that time, and I remember him saying, well, your mum's kind of stupid because she's Christian. And we had a proper argument about that on holiday one time, and I just didn't really like the way that he talked about people. So that's why that relationship kind of ended in the end. You know, he was a bit down about life and a bit angry about life. So but, you know, it was a good experience. It was you know, I would say that was a successful relationship, whereas some people, and Christians particularly, if it doesn't end in marriage, it wasn't a good relationship. You know, I don't see that there's anything wrong with it. But that for me, then I think that because I started slowly moving away from the church and stopped being programmed, you know, constantly with every time you know, you have to read the Bible, you have to do this, you have to do that. You know, let's talk about the fact that you're having sex with your boyfriend. Well, I don't want to talk about that. You know, it's not anything to do with you. And then obviously I went to live with the Amish, and it was just suddenly realizing how different, like how many different denominations there were out there. And I thought, well, why is mine the true one? And then I started reading Job as part of my Christian Union. Like I was like prefect of the Christian Union at my school. And that was actually, so basically I was 17 when I had this sudden crisis of faith, and I read Job and I thought, well, that doesn't feel very nice. Why did God do that? Like, Satan actually seems quite nice here. That, I think, you know, I didn't question it too deeply, but that then also kind of set me off because I felt like, you know, God was far away at that point in a similar way to Job. And yeah, and then it just constantly, and then just sort of spiraled from there. And I think I got to a point where I'd left, and then I moved out of home and went to drama school, and yeah, slowly started to think on my own. And I think that that's what it is. It didn't take what it took was for me to sort of go, actually, I don't know if I don't feel happy here. I'm not comfortable here. Not necessarily even with the beliefs that I had, but with the people that I was surrounding myself with and the culture that I was involved in. I think I still went to Bible study once a week. Can't really remember now, but yeah, it was more, this culture doesn't make sense to me. I don't feel like I belong here. And
did you feel like you could ask good questions? Like, did you feel like it was safe to tell people, hey, I'm inquiring, I'm digging into this issue, that issue? Or was there any sense of like, hey, don't ask too many questions, or you're blaspheming if you ask it that way?
I think the thing is that I just didn't have those questions. Not big, like not the questions of does God not exist sort of thing. Okay. Maybe I did slowly when I sort of felt, oh, God is distant from me, and you know, not talking to me. And I thought, well, maybe he's not real, and then I kind of would back that kind of thing away from me, kind of thing. Because I've said this in other interviews as well, but it was this idea of like the one thing that you can't say, the one crime or the one sin that you know that is unforgivable by God is turning your back on Jesus. And I was quite terrified that I would do that and then end up in hell. You know, or like, because that's what Satan did, right? Satan ultimately rejected God. But then the thing is that Satan believes in God, because Satan, do you know what I mean? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So Satan still had this idea that there was Jesus. I think what it is that the idea of like saying, I know God, but I don't want to be his friend or whatever. I don't want to be in his kingdom anymore. Rather than a complete rejection of even the existence of God. I don't even think that came into my mind really that much. But the questions, I mean, I do feel like I was, you know, I would ask questions and people would answer them honestly. It's not, yeah.
Did you get at all into the whole issue of just where did this come from? Where did Judaism come from? Where did Christianity come from? Because I know for a lot of people that are more in the circles that I tend to discuss things with, that's a big part of this puzzle. Is a lot of people feel rightfully upset and angry and frustrated that the church and Bible college, whatever, they didn't really give you the full information to make a good decision. So like for me, for example, my path started with, I was upset about realizing I was teaching my kids genocide with, you know, the Old Testament, go in, slaughter everybody. But that wasn't enough to deconvert me. Arguably it should have been, but it wasn't. Because if God's the king, God can call the shots, blah, blah, blah. But genocide, you know, slavery, land theft, racism, all this stuff, you know, genital mutilation, all the bad stuff of the Old Testament that Christians and apologists tend to defend, that was enough to really get the ball rolling. But that only spurred the question of, well, is this really real then? You know, if because I have to land somewhere. Either I believe this and I defend it, or I go that way and say, no, the reason this feels so uncomfortable is because I'm trying to make it fit and it doesn't, because it's not really real. And so my journey began this huge study into where did Judaism and Christianity come from. And, you know, it's issues like pagan parallels, issues with them copying mystery cults, you know, or being a mystery cult of the Greco-Roman time frame, where there were other people already talking about things like baptismal initiation into your community. You become a brother and sister. You get to receive the resurrection that your chosen deity or demigod had already done for you on your behalf. So they have all these concepts. The only thing missing is really the Judaistic part of it, which is the blood sacrifice. So you add that in because that's what they're bringing, is, you know, it has to be through blood sacrifice. And all of a sudden you're like, this is an ancient Greco-Roman blood sacrifice mystery cult, and this is not as different as I thought. And it sounds like they're copying and just amalgamating a bunch of ideas. And once I realized, and that's just literally the tip of the iceberg. But once you step back and you realize all this stuff, you're like, holy smokes, this stuff isn't real. This is made up.
So I didn't get to that point until I started studying theology at university, actually. And actually by that point I was an atheist. For me,
so wait, you studied you studied theology after you became an atheist?
Yes, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So I studied theology and religion, so I did a bit of a balance. So I do find, personally as an atheist, I find theology a bit like what's the word? I just find it a bit dull. Like I have an atheist friend who was one of the only other sort of very outspoken atheists on the course, who loves theology. He just loves the puzzle of it, right? Trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, right? I just find it really kind of dull, and it just goes on forever and ever. And there's a whole load of German people who said something once, and I don't know. I just don't really find theology particularly interesting. Maybe if I was a Christian, I would have done, but like the conversations about the Trinity and how that might work,
Did it feel like you were getting a degree in mythology, or like how did you see it? Because that's how I see my degree.
Yeah, sort of. I think because it's theology and religion. So the religion part. So I would probably say that my focus is sociology of religion, which is why I've gone on to study sociology, and didn't continue in the theology department at the university because they're obviously their focus is theology, not sociology. But that was definitely a part of it. And obviously, did you go to sort of Bible college? Is that
I did, yeah. The next step would have been seminary. I did not go there. I was a Bible college grad and 1 year of what's called mission school to be like a Bible translator.
Right. So I went to my university is a secular university, and so it's not exactly taught like this is. Maybe it would have been 10 years ago would have been taught like this is the truth.
Okay.
But I mean, so the year that I started, I don't know if you know her, but Francesca Stavrakopoulou was the head of department. So she's a very outspoken atheist and a theologian. She sort of focuses on archaeology, and she was talking about like ancient Israel basically, which is really interesting. So obviously for her, that I think there's some myth tied up in that, but there's also the idea of myth and what was actually true. Did that story actually happen and stuff like that? So we did a lot of that actually in my first year. And I do remember she's very much like, this didn't happen. Moses wasn't real. All of this stuff. We did actually the thing that kind of got me, even though I was an atheist at the time, was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't disciples of Jesus. And I know that sounds stupid because you kind of think, what? But they were like apostles, right? So they came later on, but and actually a lot of the other testaments were copies of Mark, all that sort of stuff. They sort of repeated a lot of the stuff that Mark had written, and actually nobody really knows who wrote these things. And and actually that was led by a Christian lecturer and Francesca, who's a very outspoken atheist. So that was quite a nice dynamic. And actually awesome. A lot of because in the sense of like a lot of the Department of Theology don't deny that a lot of this stuff is myth and politics and hermeneutics or whatever. So that for me was quite refreshing. But I actually didn't realize, so I believed that the literal stories, so I believed that this was history in some way, or like so maybe there wasn't a giant world flood, but then there was perhaps like it was a localized flood in the known world at that time, and so that's when Noah came from, kind of thing. Right. So there were ways of sort of squaring the putting the square peg in the round hole kind of thing. So I already I had that kind of level of scholarship of that's what I believed growing up. And so when I rejected it as a kind of I know there was levels of allegory, like so obviously the stories that Jesus told weren't true stories. They were kind of a way of teaching morality, but the actual Old Testament stories were just as true as the New Testament stories. And so what I was rejecting was well, I don't believe Jesus was real, or if he was real, he didn't die and rise again. Just doesn't make any sense. And actually I don't really know if it was the Christian story ultimately that I rejected. It was the fact that there's just no God. How can there be a God? It doesn't make sense. Yeah. How can there be a good God, right? Because I didn't really then look at, and I did talk about, well, is there a good, if God is here, he's both good and evil because there's both in the world. So I do remember thinking about all of that, but then at the same time, my rejection really was of a good God. So it wasn't necessarily a rejection of all that blood sacrifice and all that sort of narrative until I got to university. And then I realized that it was all basically a farce. I mean, all of the stuff that and a lot of Christians go, oh, she's straw manning, it's not real. That's not really what we believe. And I know that because I believe something else. And a lot of Christians as well, once they leave, from studying theology in a secular place, kind of come to a point where they realize that the Bible is fallible, but they're okay with that. Whereas I don't think I believe that the Bible was infallible because it was written by mankind, but it was kind of, I didn't realize all of the changes that it went through, and then, you know, how it passed through, you know, initially Christians were persecuted for their beliefs, and then the Catholic Church kind of saw this uprising of Christians and thought, actually, this is, well, the Catholic Church, you know what I mean, the Romans, with Constantine, said, actually, this is kind of a tool that I can use to control the people. And whether he actually believed it himself or not, I don't know. You know, there was that kind of idea that he had some sort of conversion to Christianity, and then it went through all of these councils, and, you know, and I was like, what? I didn't realize that. I thought the Bible would just been, you know, collected together, and here it was, and this was the word of God. And you know, I sort of heard things about these stories, these biblical texts that were, you know, or extra biblical texts that weren't included in the Bible, and why they weren't, like the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas, I think it was.
Yeah.
And you know, how those were heretical but the other ones weren't. But who gets to decide that? Well, God, you know, kind of inspired the these very rich, let's be honest, people, you know, right at the top, to put these into this book and then pass it on through the generations. And it's constantly changed, and even now, you know, the Catholics have a different Bible to the Protestants, with the Apocrypha and all that sort of stuff. So, but I didn't know that until I went to university at 21. I really honestly didn't know that. And I remember having a conversation with my sister after my first year of university, or during, while I was learning it, and I said to her, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John didn't write those books, or they weren't I think what it was is they weren't direct disciples of Christ. Mm-hmm. So they weren't like following Jesus around. Like I thought, and I don't know why I thought it, but they were one of the 12 disciples for some reason. And they're
anonymous. They're anonymous too. I don't think they mentioned their names. Like their names, I believe, were added later.
Right.
So it's
but I genuinely believe that they were the disciples of Jesus. They were following him around. And then I told Bethany, my sister, I should say Ezra. My sister Ezra, I suppose sister is the right terminology for them, that they were not the disciples of Christ. And they were sort of like, oh, what? How on earth, you know, is this? That's not true. Like, and I now know that they don't believe anymore either. So I wonder whether that epiphany for me made them go, huh, what? No, how? You know, this doesn't make sense. This is all a lie. And it's one really tiny thing.
Yeah.
But then it kind of, really changed the way that I looked at the Bible, as if it was like almost literal, all of these stories and all these narratives. I mean, I definitely didn't believe that the creation story was literal. It was kind of a, you know, like the periods of, you know, on this first day, the days were longer, you know, and science kind of lines up with the days, but a day didn't mean a day in like our ways. And I was able to kind of fit those together. But, you know, the stories of Jonah and the flood and all that sort of stuff, it was still kind of true. And Moses definitely still was real. Whereas the current thinking behind a lot of archaeological findings is that the story of Moses is completely fictional.
And definitely based on some other stories like Sargon and so forth. I do want to ask, I know we've gone through a lot quickly, and I had a lot more listed here, so maybe we'll even try to touch base again sometime. But so many questions I have. In wrapping up, though, I do want to ask, can you tell us what was the hardest part for you in this, with deconverting, you know, whether it's for yourself, you know, just your own thought process, you know, dealing with family that's still in, like, what was the hardest part for you, or even the, you know, the most surprisingly difficult part for you? And what is life like for someone? Because I think a lot of people feel like they almost can't quite wrap their minds around, like, what would it be like to live without Christ? You know, either, I mean, to some people, it's like, it's not just Christ, it's Christ is at the center of your thoughts. He's your world, he's your worldview, he's your all in all, he's your love, he's the love of your life. And even to live like as a liberal, like, yeah, I go to church, but, you know, I'm a Christian, but even that is hard for people to understand. But to take it further and say, no, I'm not talking about being a liberal Christian. I'm not talking about something like that. I'm just saying it's not real. Like there's no God. It's not real. I live my life as someone who is totally open to evidence, but right now the evidence points to there's no God. And Therefore, and the Bible, certainly, if there is a God, it's certainly not the God of the Bible. That
Right.
book has obviously been torn to shreds in every which way. In terms of it's obviously not reliable. It's clearly man-made. It's clearly an awful book in the sense of the genocide, the kidnapping, the slavery, etc. It's clearly copies of other religions, other pagan parallels. So it's like you're ending up with, to them, this vacuum, and to you it's and certain, like me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to me it's like you woke up for the first time. You don't have all the answers, and that's fine. I don't have all the answers. Where did it come from?
Right.
How do you get your morality? We work through those issues, but it's like, okay, regardless of what questions are there that I still have to work through, I am still on a completely different side of the fence than I was before, and I'm glad of it. And I now feel like I've got the ability to answer the questions for real for the first time without a mythological worldview. But to some people, that is really, that's crazy. That's cuckoo banana stuff. Like, that's a very sad life. It's a very empty life. So what was the hardest part for you about getting out? And what is life like now that you're on the other side of it all?
I think for the first question, the most difficult part for me, ultimately, I could probably have been all right within myself, kind of going, actually, I don't believe this. Okay, cool, let's move on and figure out what I do believe. I think when it, really comes down to it, and even now when I talk to people about, my past and my Christian beliefs and that sort of thing, was hurting people. Basically, I'm not the sort of person who likes to go around being like, you're an abusive person, you taught me this, X, Y, and Z thing that was abusive or nasty, and the word abuse does feel really like a punch in the lung to people. So when I came on that Unbelievable program, and they said, oh, well, you wouldn't go as far as Richard Dawkins to say this was abuse, would you? And I think that because I'm a nice person, right, I'm not, I'm very English in the sense that I like to bat around the bush. I don't like to stick you in the gut with my beliefs. And even it's the fact that just by saying, no, I don't believe in God anymore, I don't believe what you believe anymore, it's so wrapped up in people's identity, my mum's identity, my church's identity, the people that I grew up with and called my family, and people that I still loved very much to this day and wish well, and I know that they're extremely kind people who really have very good intentions for the world and for other people and do some extremely great work. I struggle because the things that they've taken it personally. They've taken my personal decision or my personal epiphany. I'm not telling them to change their life. I'm not telling them, I think that they're wrong, but I'm not telling them that they can't come up with their own personal and make their own choices. That they take it so literally and they get so offended by the fact that I don't believe anymore, because what we don't, I think often when I talk to other atheists who've never been Christian, they don't realize that it is your entire identity that you're rejecting, right? They don't understand that it's, Jesus lives within you, Jesus is you, these rules and this kind of way of being is you, right? And all of a sudden I'm denying that. I'm saying that's not real, that's not true, that hurt me. And I think ultimately that really gets people, because they say, well, I didn't mean to hurt you, it wasn't my intention. People don't, how can you call me an abusive, or how can you call what I've taught you abusive? Because I didn't mean to do that to you. If it wasn't intentional, it can't be abuse, right? Which is absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
But it's hurtful, right? It's hurtful to hear that what you believe is complete nonsense. And I probably would never say that to somebody, straight to their face, but that's what I think. So for me, that was the most difficult thing, was basically saying everything that makes you I reject, and everything that you've tried to put in my head I reject. So yeah, that was the most difficult and surprising for me. The idea of, well, people will come up to me and say, well, don't worry, Jesus will, you'll find Jesus again, you'll find God again, or open your heart. Or the other thing that I find really hurtful is, oh, well, you were never really a Christian anyway. Clearly, if you could leave, you were never really a Christian. Or there's the other one of, well, you still do believe, everybody knows there's a God. That's my favorite one, is everyone knows there's a God. but you've chosen to walk away because you want to live in sin. You want to do things that God doesn't want you to do. And that is quite hurtful as well, because there's no way that I would have left an all-encompassing belief, a community that loved me, all of those kinds of things that actually gave me structure and purpose in life, if I in some way had a choice. I don't have a choice. Like, I just don't believe it, right? I don't know how or why I came to this. It's probably just the way that I am, but yeah, no, so that for me is the most difficult thing. I don't like hurting people. Yeah.
But I had just a quick, not quick, a minute or two of comment here about what you said about the child abuse thing. It's one of the major focuses of my research, my thought process at this point. But if I can add this real quick, I know we're wrapping up here, but I feel like people really need to step back from the edge of Christianity. Is like you're on the edge of all these concepts. It's like, step back a little bit, look at the big picture. And I just want to, if I could, read a quick list, and I'm sorry for anyone that's been watching my videos. I've read a similar list on a recent video, but I don't want to be repetitive. But if you're looking at the question of how is this abusive, how is this psychologically abusive to children, just to give people the tip, again, this is the tip of the iceberg. And I will eventually create kind of a bigger list, and I'm sure you could add a lot to it. Everyone can, because we've all had different experiences. But you're lying about the nature of reality to children. You're implying that genocide, land theft, slavery, misogyny, kidnapping, genital mutilation are all acceptable. You're teaching them that blood magic is real and necessary. You're teaching kids that they're sinful and broken and need to be fixed from the earliest ages. You're sending mixed messages that God loves you and he has this unconditional love for you, but he will curse you if you disobey him, and that will eventually even add up to hell. You're teaching kids not to question authorities or elders and to question the narrative and party line. Just accept it because we taught it to you. Using fear to control others, the fear of God and the fear of the church. Requiring them to give up everything for mythology, the purity culture, shame culture, guilt culture that we talked about. Effectively teaching kids to put blinders on and to be really proud of it. To teach kids to be satisfied with not knowing and understanding the world. Giving them a self-image based on this mythological worldview. Teaching them that things that are clearly wrong are normal and good and actually defendable because God's doing it. Teaching them tribalism or exclusivity, teaching them that we alone are right and everyone else is wrong. Scaring kids into future punishment from a pretend God. Teaching them no boundaries. God gets to control you, even your thought life. You are always under his watchful eye. Forcing people to accept this narcissistic character of God. He's a psychopathic God who's always critical and judgmental, and he's always acting like a tyrant. You create anxiety in children for no reason whatsoever, and sometimes it even creates immaturity in us as adults. You steal people's autonomy and the ability to discover who they are and who they want to be. You set them up for trauma, shunning, and devastation if they deconvert later. You teach women to submit to men who are very bad. Even in a pride, like I'm proud of it kind of sense. You teach them to make romantic and marriage decisions based on the will of a non-existent deity. You give people lifelong emotional and spiritual power over you, such as your pastors. You create a worldview based on taboos. You create anti-science biases in many cases. You inhibit critical thinking skills. You teach them to fear a coming apocalypse. You teach them to live by tradition and faith, not by the truth. You discourage rationality. It goes on and on. You're gaslighting children. You're teaching them so many bad things, and then people are like, but I'm not abusing children. Like, you're literally destroying their life.
I think that's difficult though, because and particularly at the beginning of your list, they don't believe that what they're teaching them is a lie or mythology. So
right.
Ultimately it's difficult, because you can't say you're not teaching them the truth, because they will say, well, this is the truth. So again, I think it just comes down to intention, right? And obviously I think it's myth and I think it's not true. And obviously I can see the cruelty in teaching children things that are about the supernatural and not about reality. But I'm an empiricist, so I obviously seek those things, and I think that those things are important to human happiness and that sort of thing. But yeah, it is difficult because parents aren't intentionally trying to be nasty. Really,
right.
They're trying to save them. So you can kind of get why they go, well, I'm not being abusive, I'm saving their immortal soul. But what about their, their happiness here on earth? Is their immortal saving? Well, clearly to them, they're saving their immortal soul is far more important and valuable than their happiness here. They would rather that I suffered, or whoever suffered, if it meant that they went to live in paradise, and they, therefore they've done their job as parents. So it's really hard.
Well, we're probably verging on something that we almost should do another show on, because it's so interesting. But to me, it's like, and I want to get back to the final question about what's life like now. But just if you're teaching kids to defend genocide, which the Bible does, I mean, it's not just defend it like, oh, God's okay with it. God actually commands it. That is equivalent to teaching kids Nazism. And it's like, at what point are people going to step back and say, I'm not going to be okay with Nazism as an alternative viewpoint? Like, it's not acceptable.
But then they don't teach genocide. Do you know what I mean? They don't say, they never, I don't think I've heard a Christian say genocide is okay. Do you know what I mean? I don't, and
well, it's just, they're not teaching the Bible, right? They're just ignoring.
Right. What they're doing is that what they're saying is God can do anything. And, the story of Isaac, for example, Abraham and Isaac, God tells you to kill your son, you kill your son. I definitely have had the problem with that even as a child. I thought, well, that's not very nice. And God was basically just playing an elaborate joke on Abraham, like, not really. So you're right. What they're saying is, if God tells you to do it, you do it. But then how do you decipher from your own voice and that of God? And I would say that my own voice is telling me don't commit genocide, but there's probably a hell of and God's voice is saying, yeah, actually, no, do you know what? That's a really good idea. But then obviously a lot of Christians would say, oh no, God would never tell me to commit genocide. That's horrible. Why would he do that? But then you just have to look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and say, well, he did that for people in the past. Why is he not doing that now? I mean, did it for Joan of Arc? If Jesus is God, if Jesus is Yahweh, then did this loving, sweet, tender Jesus is the God who said, go slaughter everybody. It's the only way they can really get around it not being a Nazistic perspective is to just ignore it. And a lot of people do. There's a lot of churches here that have been accused, by the traditional churches of saying, why are you guys ignoring the Old Testament? Teach it. And they're like, no, we're going to be more of a New Testament-y church. And it's one way they get around it. But I don't want to distract from the main your story, because that's more of a topic than your story. But what's life like as an atheist? To wrap us up. That's a really strange question. It's kind of like, I don't know. It's not, because for a lot of people, I mean, obviously I spend a lot of my time talking about religion and theology and beliefs. So not just Christian beliefs, but, non-religious beliefs, and also beliefs of other religions and spiritualities. So I'm fascinated by it, but it's more of an academic perspective. So obviously I spend a lot, because people say, oh, why do you spend so much of your time as an atheist talking about these things? If you don't believe in God, then why are you talking about God? And for me, what's interesting is that other people believe in God. I find it fascinating that people are so they want to believe in it so much. So that's why I study it. That's why I find it interesting. I'm interested. I don't study theology. I study people who study theology, if that makes sense. So I'm fascinated by people who find theology convincing and useful and interesting. I just don't understand it. So I that's particularly what I'm interested in. But as an atheist, I think you initially have to restructure your entire life, right? So you have to go, hey, what is it I really believe about this? Do I really want to have a 9-to-5 kind of job? It's not just about religion. It's not just about, it's about like, how do I live a life that makes me happy? That's the different question. It's not about, I think that's where it comes down to, is how do I, as a Christian, what I'm thinking about is, how do I live a life that makes God happy? Whereas then when you get rid of God and you stop believing in God, you kind of go, okay, well, how do I live a life that makes me happy?
Yeah.
Because I realize that ultimately the only experience I will ever know, and the only thing that will happen on my deathbed is, if I even get to a deathbed, I will look back on my life and say, did I live my life in a way that made me happy and the people around me happy? So a lot of people think that as an atheist, my point of view is very selfish and it's all about me, and it's all about what makes me happy. And actually, to be honest with you, I think that a Christian perspective is just as selfish as an atheist one. That's what I think human beings are ultimately selfish creatures. If we look at it in the grand scheme of life, the circle of life, all it is a fight to survive and to live a good quality life. Because if you live a good quality life, you live longer. I don't personally want to have children, but the idea is, and that's our evolutionary process is, you have better offspring who so if you look at it at that kind of minute level, that's probably why we are selfish in that way. But I think what's the difference between me, like atheist me, and Christian me, is that I realize I'm selfish. Like, I know that Christians obviously say, oh, I'm such a selfish person, I'm so terrible, aren't I awful? But what I mean is, I'm selfish, and it's not a bad thing. I'm selfish, and that's my human nature. And obviously, whereas a Christian would reject their human nature, I've sort of embraced that and gone, actually, okay, so what is important to me, and what is important, in order to develop the kind of world that I personally want to see. And I mean, a Christian might argue, well, Stalin wanted to see a certain world, and was that okay? Well, yeah, according to Stalin's worldview, that was okay. Doesn't mean that according to my worldview that's okay. But the majority of people, I think, want to live a life that is good, a life that is loving, a life that is kind, and but also I think a life where my needs get put first. And I think that's the complete difference between me in the Christian me, if that makes sense. I didn't put my needs at the forefront. I never asked myself really the question, what do I want? It was always, what do I want, and is that in line with God? Is that in line with what Jesus would have wanted for me? So I think that's the main difference. And actually, that I've had to learn to live in a place where I accept that I don't really know a lot of things, and instead of going, well, mystery of God, like that's just God's mysterious ways, I just kind of go, well, we don't know, because that's exactly what it is. It's not God. It's the unknown, and maybe we'll find out, and maybe I can talk to people who know more than me. And it is, some people say that being an atheist is kind of arrogant, because you say you're leaning on your own understanding, kind of thing, rather than the understanding of God. But I do think that Christians are doing that anyway, just without knowing.
And it's not really leaning on God, it's leaning on a bunch of very bad men, followed by a bunch of other men who edited and changed and redacted it. It's amazing, the mentality.
Putting your faith in, they're putting their faith just as much in mankind as I am, except in fact I don't think I put my faith in many historical figures anyway. I am allowed to question the character of Darwin, or the character of all of these kind of scientists, who actually quite a lot of them are very bad men, according to my worldview, according to the way that I want the world to look. So I think that living a non-religious life means asking yourself some very difficult questions, and ultimately not always coming to a conclusion about what you think and what you agree with, and actually just testing the waters. And it allows you to to have trial and error for things that you just never would have questioned before. And is that good for you? Is it not good for you? That sort of thing. So it's definitely more difficult, because there is no answer. There is no set there's no set thing to fall back on. You have to create those structures. You have to create that meaning in your life. And so I think for a lot of people that seems vapid and empty, whereas for me it's like going into creative mode on Minecraft, and being given all of these kinds of, you're not fighting to survive anymore. You're just being given 100 million types of block, and you're building your life, and you're building your house or your castle or whatever the hell you want to build out of these blocks. And it's infinite, and there are so many ways to look at the world. And so it's opened up a huge world for me that I never had before. There isn't one way to live your life. There isn't one way to build your house, hence I live in a bus. There's not one way to look at things, and it allows for a lot more creativity, but then also a lot more uncertainty. So it depends on whether you can take that. Yeah.
Well, Hannah, you've given us a lot to think about. I mean, it's just, we could go on and on about a lot of these subjects, and I hope it can touch base. I have a lot of other notes I had, so I will table them for the next conversation. But I just appreciate your willingness to share. You're obviously very open. You're very willing to share your story and to share some of the painful parts even. And I think a lot of people need to hear stories like yours. I appreciate you being willing to do that. I appreciate your especially willingness to be public, like on with Justin Brierley's Unbelievable program, because that's hard. That's hard work to be that in the limelight and to be able to defend yourself in an articulate way that you can quickly, bring your thoughts together and help people to, just basically articulate the atheist argument for some of these things and the humanist argument. So I just appreciate your willingness to be a part of this and to have such a strong voice and a platform. And I look forward to keeping the conversation going with you over time. And thank you so much for doing this today.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you for making a platform for these kinds of conversations, because I think it's very important. I wouldn't be able to talk about these things without people like you. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, we'll do it again soon. Thank you so much.